When we saw first pics of the new generation WRX in the Chasing Cars office, the guys were fairly vehement about their hatred for the cladding down the side of the car and the general shape of it, although Subaru calls the cladding sporty side garnishing, so whatever. I said to them, wait till you see it in the flesh, because I reckon the proportion of it is actually pretty good. I saw the previous generation WRX this morning before coming to film this car right here, which is an RS manual, and it kind of dorky compared to this WRX here, although I'm not saying this is perfect, but it does have a lot more shape and visual appeal than the previous model. Let us know what you think in the comments, but I'm just going to take us through a little bit about the styling of the car and what makes up this new generation WRX. Now, it is a little bit of a tale of two halves in a way, where Subaru's tried to minimize and refine it in some areas, and yet in other areas it's not really that at all. It looks like it might be kind of like an Outback-ish version of a performance sedan, but it only has 135 millimeters of ground clearance. So it's sucked to the road, but it looks like it could do a Paris-Dakar stage. I don't know. There's going to be a sweet spot in there somewhere. Whether it has discovered that yet, who knows? Anyway, this car here is the mid-spec model. It's the RS. It's available in a 6-speed manual like the base WRX that's just called WRX, and a CVT Subaru Performance Transmission version, which is $4,000 more for both of those models. The model above this is called the TS. It has adaptive dampers. It's CVT only. The Sport Wagon other side, which is a Levorg in any other country other than ours, and let's be honest, really should be called Levorg here because their suspension tunes are so different that they're actually quite different cars, even though they're the same car pretty much. That also comes in 3 specs: Sport Wagon, GT and TS. The TS again having adaptive dampers, but you know, that's otherwise these have their different suspension tunes. This car here might share sheet metal with the Sport Wagon, but it does look quite different. It has all of this sort of added on plastic stuff at the front that is in excess at the back, as we shall discover, and runs around in the garnishing around the wheel arches. A lot of it's about airflow. Subaru reckons that it's low, and it has these sort of little vent outlets down the side around the wheel arches to make airflow through the car. They make all these aerodynamic claims, but I haven't seen a drag coefficient, so who knows what that is. The front bonnet scoop is 20 millimeters lower than before to make it a bit sleeker. The mirrors are 50 millimeters shallower than they were before. They looked like Dumbo ears before. Now they just look like normal mirrors, and that's great. The headlights in all of these WRX models are turn with the steering, are adaptive, although you can turn it off through the screen in the middle. Other changes between the wagon and this is that it has 18 by 8.5 inch wide alloys instead of 7.5. So these cars have 245/45 R18 tyres instead of 225/45s. The other ones are Yokohama Blue Earth on the wagon. On these ones, they're Dunlop SP Sport Max. So a step up in the performance level. All of them have the same brakes, which aren't really that fancy. They're 316 millimeter ventilated front discs at the front with 2 piston calipers, 290 at the rear. And I suppose as we may test when we're out on the road, certainly on a racetrack, I think that would be challenging the ability of these a little bit. It'd be nice to be able to potentially have a brake upgrade for this car, but for road use, they're fine. The rest of the car is actually quite a lot different in proportion to the previous WRX. The wheelbase has only grown by 25 millimeters to be tiny bit longer than the Impreza that this car is based on, but it's 75 millimeters longer overall, 30 millimeters wider, 10 millimeters lower. So a little bit better proportion, very close to what Liberty's used to be, and way bigger than, say, a Liberty RS of the early 90s. This is over 10 centimeters wider than that car. This is quite a big car, and when we get inside it, you'll see what that achieves in terms of space and practicality. While I really like how much more animated the face of the new WRX is, my favourite part of the styling is this rear haunch here, this lovely blistered guard that starts here in the back door and runs and sweeps into these sort of angled taillights and combines with the taper of the rear roofline to just give it this stance that's so much more dynamic than the old car's sort of blockiness. I think it just gives an extra element of chic to the WRX. It makes it look so much cooler. That's just my opinion, but let us know what you think. Same, I think, about these alloys. Subaru says they're black, but they're not. They're metallic charcoal. They're on the base WRX and the RS. The TS gets these sort of swirly machine face things that don't look anywhere near as cool as that. So while you miss out on the adaptive dampers, you do get those wheels, which I really like. Being a sedan, we have all of the boot space that comes with. There's two different boot sizes. We have 411 litres if you have the RS or the TS, because they have a subwoofer right there for the Harman Kardon stereo that hangs down a little bit. You get 3 more litres of boot space if you get the one without that, but doesn't everyone want the stereo? I don't know whether everyone wants this sporty garnishing down here. I think it's a little bit too black, but I do love those 4 tailpipes. They look like something that you would have added aftermarket, and they're on the stock car, which I think is really cool. In here, it's pretty basic. It's just felt trimming. There's a 17-inch temporary spare underneath, a 205 wide spare. You can't drop the backrest down from in here. You have to do them from inside, but they do go mostly flat. This is nice, but it's just a little bit low rent. And in 2022, if you're trying to convince people that the sedan is still relevant, why isn't there anything to hold on to shut the boot? You've got to put your fingers on it and make all of this shit come along here, which annoys the shit out of me. At least the detailing and the lights, which are pretty simple, but have this sort of broken glass effect in them, makes up for some of the other bits of cheapness. The badge work is not too excessive, and this built-in spoiler, which is not built-in, it's just tacked on, but it isn't hanging up like this, kind of adds to the sort of subtle but outlandish flavour. The WRX is both shy and wild, and how do you combine those two? We'll find out when we drive it. Now, there's only 2 6-speed manual variants in that 6 model WRX range, and that is the base Rex sedan and this RS model. What this RS brings over the standard car is a fair amount. The standard manual is $44,990 before on-road costs. This is $54,990, so what's that? You do the maths. It brings things like the ultra suede seats here, which I like a lot better than the leather in that GT Sport wagon we drove the other week. These are shared with the TS model above. I love this suede stuff. I think they're really good. They're 8-way electric adjustment for both front seats here. They're heated for both front seats, and the driver has electric lumbar support, none of which is in the standard sedan. We also have a sunroof. We have electrically heating door mirrors. All of them have power folding, but they can only be done by this button on the door here, which I think is kind of, I don't know, annoying. They should fold when you lock the car, in my opinion. You also get satellite navigation embedded in this 11.6-inch portrait touchscreen. Most importantly, you get the 10-speaker Harman Kardon stereo with the subwoofer in the rear parcel shelf, as I pointed out earlier. You get heating for the outboard back seats. You get USB ports for the back seat. We have heating in the front, as I mentioned. We've got 2 USB ports here, plus an auxiliary point, plus a 12-volt outlet. There's quite a lot of stuff in here that sort of makes this model at $50,000 seem a pretty good buy. I wish that Subaru spent a little bit more time making some of the other things a little bit more sensible. Like, we have this full panel here, which is nicely rubberized and whatever, but it just looks prime for wireless charging, which it doesn't offer. And this little thing in here is tiny, although it does have another little, actually not even a 12-volt outlet, it's just a blank. It has a blank in there. This camping bottle here doesn't fit in anything. Like, as I pointed out when I did the wagon one, the armrests here are sloped, so the drink should go in that way, but the cup holder's shaped vertically. So it just doesn't work, which is kind of annoying. But other than that, it's actually really nice to be in here. The view's great, the cow's nice and low, the seats are really comfortable. The steering wheel's a little bit too fat for my liking. It's just, the rim's too thick. I wish it to just be a little bit thinner. You do sit quite high in the WRX though. At times you go, oh yeah, I'm really quite high in this car. I feel like if Subaru ever did do the STI version, which they've said they're not now, and it had those Recaro buckets or whatever it used to have before, you'd be much lower to the ground and you'd feel like a bit more like you're in a traditional Rex, whereas here it again has that element of Outback-esque Paris-Dakar-ish thing, but then you've got the SIF suspension and the no ground clearance, so it doesn't all quite sit together ideally. The rest of the interior works pretty well. You know, having separate temperature adjustment for the HVAC here means you don't have to always go through this screen here to find it, but if you want the seat heating, you've got to hit the heating button, and then you've got to do that separately. You can't just do it externally, which is kind of annoying. Mostly the swipe stuff and these little bits up the top here and all that is pretty easy, all pretty easy to use. All of this stuff's pretty easy to use. This RS model, being a manual, is even easier than the CVT because it loses quite a lot of the safety stuff. It doesn't get the full eyesight thing, so it doesn't have all of those layers of potentially annoying lane centering assist, lane keep assist. I'll run through it when I drive the car, but there's a lot of it. And you means here that on your cruise control on the right here, you can tell that it's just basic cruise control. There's no adaptive cruise. It does miss out on that stuff. So if you really need those things, which I would argue that you don't necessarily, then buy the CVT. It's interesting that the WRX maintains Subaru's current tradition of having all the doors open really wide. I think that's sort of become a thing rather than everyone remembering that they no longer have frameless doors, which they haven't had since 2007 in this size. Anyway, in the back seat of the WRX here, I don't think it's quite as nice as in the Sport Wagon. In this RS version, we have dark headlining. It is pretty dark in here. The backrest is a little bit too far reclined, in my opinion. The base is pretty good. It is longer than before. You do sit deeper than in the old model, and there's a reasonable amount of knee room. I've got an okay amount of headroom sitting behind the sunroof, which dips just there. Okay tow room, given that the front seat's all the way down. It's all okay. It's not luxurious, but it's not poverty either, if you get what I mean. The seat trim is the same as the front pretty much, although this is all vinyl in the middle here. The door trims match the front in terms of being slightly squishy with squishy armrests and also having that rubbish bottle storage. We've only got one map pocket, and as I mentioned before, we've got the two outboard seat heaters, two setting with this pair of 2.1 amp USB chargers. The center seat can be sat in. It's okay. It's bearable. It's not terrible, but it's all kind of more about the front occupants in this WRX sedan than it is about anyone in here, although you aren't choked for space. The combined fuel consumption figure for the WRX manual is 9.9 litres per 100 kilometres, which compares to 8.5 for the CVT version. The urban claim for these cars is 13.8 litres per 100 kilometres for the manual, 11.2 for the CVT. So our average of 13.4 for this RS manual kind of fits in with what Subaru said, which is expected to be thirsty. And though that is with no freeway driving, that is just cornering and city stuff. The warranty for Subaru in Australia is 5 years or unlimited kilometres, whereas the recommended scheduled servicing is every 12 months or 15,000 kilometres, with the 5-year 75,000 servicing cost being $2,433. With a much stronger chassis than before, Subaru says it's 28% more torsionally rigid, 14% more in front lateral bending than the previous WRX. There's a pretty stiff basis to work with here. But the non-adaptively damped WRX sedan is also pretty stiff, full stop. Like, this car's forte is really cornering. It's certainly not ride, but we can't really film it on the roads with the great corners because, as you can probably already see, it's sort of quite vertically pitchy. It sort of jiggles around on bumps when it goes through a corner, even though it hooks in really well, turns in nicely, and has great traction. It's just a little bit like an amusement ride, which is kind of fun because that's what these cars are meant to be about, but at the same time, it's not entirely conducive for filming things smoothly. So we're going to talk about the rest of the WRX's dynamics while driving on a perfectly smooth bitch of paved road, because then I'm not lolling about like I was, although having fun in the corners. I think the thing about the WRX RS manual sedan, because I have to mention the manual part because it has a fully mechanical all drive system. It has a center differential and a viscous coupled limited slip rear diff. Unlike the electronically controlled system that's normally split 45-55 in the CVT ones and can change, this one splits front to rear axle drive simply based on what traction it has. But, you know, as we just saw, it really hangs on well. It's really well balanced. It doesn't really have any understeer anymore, not like in the past. As long as you drive it reasonably well, you don't even have to drive it perfectly, it's good. But it just has a lot of that vertical suspension movement that just makes it feel a little bit aftermarket. And I know, because I've owned Subarus with aftermarket suspension. If only it could have the adaptively damped stuff, I think that would probably make a big difference. According to my colleagues it does, but I haven't driven it. Either way, on a smooth road, this is still really fun. It might move around a lot in a corner, but in terms of its turn-in, the way that it puts its power down and its speed in the mid-corner, and the way that it powers out of a corner is really great. I've had it in track DSC, so you hit the ESC button once and it says track, which obviously loosens the stability control's grip. I haven't barely seen it flicker at all. Like, it's just been great. And that's on these quite challenging roads. They're really tight. There's a lot of bumps in the corners. It can handle it because the body control in this WRX manual compared to, say, the Sport Wagon, which is really quite soft and lacking a bit in body control, the body control in this thing is razor sharp, really tight. But the byproduct of that is that rubbish ride, which the faster you go, the better it gets. But again, it just isn't as polished as it should be. The drivetrain in the WRX, on paper again, is not really that exciting. It has 202 kilowatts at 5,600 RPM, which is only 5 kilowatts more than the old 2-litre had, and this is now a 2.4 heavily re-engineered. The torque is the same. It's 350 Newton meters, but it's from 2,000 RPM to 5,200 RPM flat. That's just a big chunk of torque, and it does make this really drivable. There isn't a massive sensation of performance in the WRX, but it's strong and it's really tractable. I think part of that, though, is based upon the gearing itself. Like, second gear in the 2000s in any 1.5 litre front drive hatch went to 88 kilometers an hour, and the 2022 WRX 6-speed manual does 85. So that's pretty low, and that's at just over 6,000 RPM. It doesn't go anywhere beyond the red line. It's like 6.1. But you don't need to rev it. It's certainly gone are the days of the mid-7s for Subaru flat 4 turbos, but now we have tractability, unlike in the past. The fuel economy, as we may have noticed, is not great, but it's good when you're cruising. It's just, you know what, it's actually not that much worse when you're hammering it than when you're driving in traffic. So if you care about that stuff, buy the CVT and get all the safety features that this one misses out on, which is lane centering function, lane keep function, emergency lane keep, stuff like all of those annoying things that you've got to go through the screen and turn off. This manual just doesn't have it all. It doesn't get rear AB, it doesn't get emergency lane keep assist, it doesn't have intelligent speed sign assist. There's so many things, it's hard to remember what all of them are. But I feel like the person who's buying the 6-speed manual WRX probably cares less about that stuff, and certainly will need to, than the person who buys the CVT version, which is the top TS, or this one for $4,000 more. The manual transmission itself is actually quite slick. It's the old WRX's 6-speed manual with a few modifications. As long as you depress the pedal at the right time, it's actually really nice. I haven't been rushing it too much, but in the bits that I have, it actually has seemed to get better the faster you shift, much like the BRZ, which is kind of cool. But what the WRX doesn't share with the BRZ is that beautiful balance between ride and handling poise. That exquisite way that it blends all that together just isn't really present in this car. It is a great handling car, but it just doesn't blend that with enough comfort at the same time. And the steering, while it is really quick, it only has 2.7 turns lock to lock, but it is instantly, like, you can feel the car moving just from that. It is really sharp and it turns in really well. It just doesn't really have any true feel. It's a dual pinion electric steering system that does have no slack, and the weighting's really good. It's just not really that natural around there. You're driving this WRX again on the feeling of its chassis rather than what you're getting through the steering wheel. As for the brakes, it's 290mm vented rear discs in the manual. It's 300 in the CVT, and as I mentioned before, 316 at the front. They're not really that powerful in terms of being hammered. They are good for most driving, but I suspect that on a track they're going to wilt, and there isn't another option to go the next step, and there's not going to be an STI. So a car as strong as this, that handles as well as this, that could be as good as this, is going to need to have some aftermarket modification to make up for that. As for the seats and stuff, they don't need to be aftermarket at all. This is a really comfortable, cool, great view, performance sedan. It's just a little bit of product planning and finessing away from being everything it could be. This, with the best suspension, might be the best model, but until that car exists, it doesn't exist at all. Two more things I like about the WRX RS manual sedan though. One is the engine sound. There's no synthesized crap on top of this. It is just the natural flat four, really quite refined, really nicely torquey. It sounds like a Subaru engine. And the other is this portrait touchscreen, which is so much better designed than the similar system, I think, in the Outback. It's not as bunchy, and having the 10-speaker Harman Kardon with Apple CarPlay and stuff, it sounds really quite great. I love it. It's significantly better than the 6-speaker setup that's unfortunately in all the sport wagons, because they can't get the subwoofer in their non-existent parcel shelf. There is no doubt that the new generation WRX is a good thing. It is fun to drive, it's roomy, it looks way better than before, it's available in a broader range, it has more technology, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff does make this a better WRX, but is it the range that it should be? In Australia, as we know, the Levorg is called the WRX Sport Wagon, and it has a very different suspension tune to this car here, which is the RS manual. It is absolutely chalk and cheese. When you get in the wagon, you think how refined and supple it is, and when you get in this non-adaptive dampered sedan, you kind of think the opposite. And so I kind of feel like the product planning for this vehicle just isn't quite right. That top spec model should be a top spec in equipment and finishes, not just having the elitism of saving the adaptive dampers to the top model that isn't even available with a manual transmission. And so arguably the best suspension setup, because I haven't driven the adaptive dampered one, I've only done the Swift sedan and the soft wagon, is saved for the top model that, I don't know, it just doesn't, to me, make sense. This car would be a lot better if it had a suspension setup that gave it a level of suppleness, because it just doesn't have that. At times it can be really fun, and the drivetrain is really strong, the way that it sits, all of that stuff is great. But there are moments where driving this RS manual sedan is tiresome. It does wear you out. It is not an older person's car. That drives like my Liberty RS did in the 90s, when I had lowered it and done all that stuff to it when I was in my 20s, and now that I'm not 25 anymore, I think that that could be a little bit tiresome after a while, and that's a shame, because it deserves better than that, because it is a really good car, but it's just one comprehensive rethink, certainly in terms of its dynamics, away from achieving what it can really do. If you haven't subscribed, please do so below the video. Tell us what you think about the WRX sedan, the whole sport wagon versus Levorg thing. What do you reckon they should have done? Comment on Chasing Cars. Please hit the notification bell and subscribe, and thanks for watching.